At long last, it is time to address the ugly with this adaptation. Is the movie Gods and Generals nothing more than lost cause propaganda? With consideration to others who've shared their opinion that this is emphatically the case, and while I might disagree with some of the arguments made, I often find myself disagreeing with more military aspects of interpretation than anything else, well, it isn't exactly difficult to see why many would hold this view. Specifically referring to the popular YouTuber Atinche Films, that channel has already conducted a comprehensive campaign to debunk the lost cause myth that still tends to strongly resonate. Even here in New Zealand, just when I think I've heard every piece of propagandizing for the lost cause, something novel and argument arises to redirect the burden of responsibility for past ills. My favourites include the story of Robert E. Lee kneeling with a black man in prayer at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in June of 1865. The spin that would follow certainly had me duped in my youth, even believing Lee held of abolitionist tendencies and spoke through his actions in support of racial equality.
Of course not, don't be ridiculous.
Or the emergence of the Ku Klux Klan from a social club, tiddlywinks and the like, then becoming an underground police force to combat the volume of carpetbaggers arriving in the South during Reconstruction. Please note, I'm not seeking to imply these are entirely fictitious events, but the lengths these undergo interpretations appeasing lost cause mythology can certainly be argued to a rewriting of reality. Before falling down yet another rabbit hole of discussion, returning to the movie, is Gods and Generals merely another representation of lost cause propaganda?
Them Yankees is coming sure as Jesus. They got 2 pontoons nearly across that river. We got to get you and them children out of here in a hurry.
Mother, you stop your fussing with me. You get your own family ready. We'll all of us leave together.
Is this your master's place?
This is my place. Children?
There's something these Yankees do not understand, will never understand. You see these rivers and valleys and streams, fields, even towns, they're just markings on a map to those people in the war office in Washington.
If the Republicans lose their little war, they are voted out in the next election and they return to their homes in New York or Massachusetts or Illinois, fat with their war profits. If we lose our country.
What's about Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation? Oh, it says here that enlistments are down and desertions are up.
Any grumbling among the men?
Well, not in our regiment. I mean, there are a few wondering out loud about why they should be risking their lives for the darkies.
Here, it's to the sultry, balmy south.
Okay, driver, if you're not going to stop this bus, then I'm going to stop it for you.
Then think winter of our discontent. What a glorious summer it will be. The South is free of these meddling Yankees.
We Virginians have determined that not one spot of her sacred soil be polluted by the foot of an invader.
Then them Yankees come and burn down his house, and the next thing you know, the man who's paying me wages is in the Confederate Army. And so am I.
And I'm proud to report that the vote in the Shenandoah Valley is 3,130 in favor, 10 against. And in my own Rockbridge County, only one person voted against leaving the Union.
Probably the village idiot.
Freeing the slaves wasn't a war aim when this all began, but war changes things. It sorts things out.
Well, I don't know, Lawrence. I mean, not everybody feels the way we do about the darkies, especially when it comes to fighting and dying.
Tom, do me a favor. Don't call me Lawrence, and don't call Negroes darkies. That's a patronizing expression from which we must free ourselves.
How did that get in here? He's not a Confederate. This was included in the film. Well put, but how about this for a whataboutism? I often hear this argument about Union causality shifting from the Union's preservation, that war changes things, sorts things out. Could this argument not also apply to the South? I mean, as early as 1862, those in possession of high command questioned, even proposed the arming of black folk in the Confederate Army.
Oh my. the cause.
They knew a war of attrition would not bode well, out-resourced and outgunned. They would have to choose one or the other, preservation of that peculiar institution or independence.
Stop. Just stop doing it. You're going to drive me crazy.
This would again arise with Patrick Cleburne in 1864 and receive approval from the Confederate Congress in March of 1865. Sorry about that. Sometimes one must just take a cold shower or reclaim some form of equilibrium with a more pleasing offering to the palate. To sit back, relax, and watch a classic with few faults. But alas,
the soul must
Okay, if not persisting with the repeated argument about the protection of home and country, the preservation of states' rights, and the Jeffersonian interpretation they can act autonomously, leaving when they disagree with policy at a federal level, or when someone they don't agree with is elected, are we at least going to talk, and at any point, about the preservation of slavery as or the principal cause for the war?
Damn money-grubbing Yankees. I mean, those damn fools, they don't get the message. Always the darkies.
I'm not a northerner, nor am I an American.
What do you know about it? Nothing.
Possibly true. But as we continue, perhaps I might just surprise you. With Martha and her family, I'm sure their owners...
Are you okay?
I'm fine. I just threw up in my mouth a little bit.
Jane Beale and her family were not the incarnation of demonic spawn. But can we see the thousands of enslaved people fleeing across the Rappahannock to cast off their bindings and claim freedom behind the Union lines? Perhaps we might even see the plight of African Americans as they face recapture, taken as contraband or spoils of war. But hey, look at those evil Yankees looting and causing notable destruction to property. I wonder if they'll take or destroy the slave auction block. Nope, never mind, having fact-checked that, took place in 2017. But I'm still right. Those darn Yankees! Hey, the Bonnie Blue Flag. Personally, I prefer Southern Soldier or Dixieland, but it is a catchy tune. I'm certainly looking forward to a rendition of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, or John Brown's Body, or perhaps the Battle Cry of Freedom. Another personal favourite being When Johnny Comes Marching Home came a little later in 1863, so I wouldn't expect that one. Do we get anything, any form of balance?
You serious?
Wait, no, this makes perfect sense. As a Confederate officer conferred to a Union counterpart at Appomattox, if we had your music, sir, we'd have whipped you out of your boots. Seeing things weren't going so well for the Union in Virginia, perhaps this was also a creative decision. For how much longer should I give Maxwell here the benefit of the doubt? Deviating from these talking points, and when highlighting the good with the Virginian narrative around Lee and Jackson, once more the question looms over balance. And there just isn't any of that to speak of. If one were to consider this a biopic for specifically Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and when looking at the uglier aspects of this history, would not his personal involvement with that peculiar institution prove interesting? The good slaveholder, if intent on arguing this point, or the bad? And lastly, the ugly. Was Jackson an abolitionist? The answer is a simple no. His household would include 6 slaves in Aunt Amy, Hetty, George, Cyrus, Albert, and Emma. And the stories behind these individuals are also fascinating. Larry Spurgeon's 2018 paper on the subject is to what I refer henceforth. With Aunt Amy, it is where the infamous, memorable line came, "Black man's friend." But his letters illustrate she meant quite a lot to him upon her passing. Jackson would write, and I quote, More than once your kind and touching letter respecting the sainted Amy brought tears to my eyes. End quote. I found most interesting the relationship he had with Albert, how he'd supposedly plead for Jackson to buy him so that he could pay off the debt and obtain his own emancipation. With Hetty, Anna would talk of her with notable fondness, and with Jackson's death she would prove, at least according to Anna, to be, and I quote, a sincere mourner for him, her tears flowing freely, and she said she lost her best friend, end quote. With George and Cyrus, there's notable attention through the citing of letters between Jackson and his wife Anna, where he was insistent that whomever they serve basically not be a prick. I could go on, it is a worthwhile read. Then there's Jim Lewis.
There's some that calls me Uncle Jim, some calls me Big Jim, some folks just calls me Jim.
I don't suppose you've heard any of the names I get called.
His relationship with Jackson is certainly worthy of a biopic. I have often wondered how effective it'd serve to have him as the protagonist and member of Jackson's staff, reminiscent to the series The Good Lord Bird, starring Ethan Hawke and Joshua Caleb Johnson. Jim Lewis, or James Alexander, and with Gods and Generals, would prove another wasted opportunity. I like one account where he'd refused Jackson's request for a certain horse in Old Sorrel, and where Jackson would concede the argument. Having a black person as part of a Confederate general's staff wasn't unheard of. I've recently finished reading 2022's Dreams of Victory by Sean Chick about General Pierre Gustave Tourtent Beauregard, and he had an unusual staff that included a slave named Frederick McGinnis, who he rented as his servant. With Jim Lewis, there are accounts of him leading Jackson's funeral procession with his favourite horse, and quoted as saying, "I never knew a piouser gentleman." One of Jackson's aides, Henry Kidd Douglas, would note, and I quote, "Jim's honest grief was almost inconsolable," end quote, with respect to Jackson being mortally wounded. Jim then served Sandy Pendleton, who would die at the Battle of Fisher Hill. He would say, and I quote, "Major, de dear old general's gone, and Mars Sandy's, and it's Jim's time next," end quote. A self-fulfilling prophecy, as he would shortly pass thereafter from a presumed lung-related disease. Wyatt would seem a waste, and while not a focus in the novel, as highlighted through the collection of scenes, Jim Lewis would serve as a more prominent character in this adaptation, and yet the depiction still comes across as somewhat shallow. Half-hearted, if you will, with limited exploration nor any meaningful points of juxtaposition. Again, sanitizing the reality, willfully ignoring the elephant in the room. Yes, it would seem evident that Jackson did not exemplify the narrative of the cruel and grotesque slaver we often envisage or recognize through various representations across history, or of the John C. Calhoun variety that saw slavery as a moral good.
I will take the ones Platt and Eliza.
Sold, Eliza and Platt, splendid. How dare you?
You will not say that from me!
But with the sanitization of Confederate history, this is one of, if not the biggest issue with Maxwell's Gods and Generals. Not only of Southern causality and sentiment, but for its depiction of slavery itself. Slavery should make us feel uncomfortable, and while I acknowledge the inclusion of its perceived normalcy and acceptance without the overtly horrific representations to where we've become so accustomed in most cinematic offerings of recent times, there needs to be a counterpoint. Once more, the lack of any balance persists, and it presents as disingenuous, or even as blatant denialism for the horrors, the persecution based on race, and the institutionalized cruelty that was chattel slavery. One working theory I have for the creative decisions here, and factoring the use of respected historical figures as protagonists, including the need to appease the film rating system, well, the sanitization that takes place seemed inevitable and would stand in stark contrast with the reality, to the horrors of civil war, and where it would lean into a more sympathetic account of its protagonists, even glorifying the bloodshed of such events as being heroic. And this appeasement only continues without any semblance of confrontation. Unlike the vast majority of the Confederate leadership, Jackson was both complicit and a participant, seeking to rationalize slavery as a byproduct of divine providence. You know, the old chestnut, that it's in God's hands and the like. For those religious, I suppose that would be proven true through Lincoln and those many who fought for that noble cause as the instruments of God's will. Moreover, he presumably had no qualm upon his capture of Harper's Ferry and the over 12,000 federal troops, with how his men proceeded to seize thousands of refugee slaves, including free men of colour, intent on returning them to bondage.
Jim, you must know that there are some officers in this army who are of the opinion that
We should be enlisting Negroes as a condition for freedom.
As a side note, and despite prior mention of Ewell and his proposal to recruit slaves in the Army of Northern Virginia, he would also seize and ship south captured people of colour during the Gettysburg Campaign. Suffice it to say, Jackson's own views on slavery and racial equality could be best described as complicated, even complex. Does that not make an extremely interesting character for a biopic? Servile insurrection would also seem a noteworthy motivator for his siding and serving with the Confederacy. Typical of that time and place, and guess what? We received this in the novel. There was a chapter attributed to him in audience to the hanging of John Brown in Virginia.
What a beautiful country.
Shara would also cover how Lee had received instruction to quell John Brown's raid, have him surround Harper's Ferry with Marines and local militia. Rather than telling us, and much like Shara, Maxwell could have shown us of this pivotal event, related this to Jackson and to his motivations and fears. Would this also be perceived as an embellishment to a more positive interpretation of Jackson? Sure, at least so far as we know. But with compared to what we received, well...
Your people will be free. One way or t'other. The only question is whether the Southern government will have the good sense to do it first and soon, and in so doing seal a bond of enduring friendship between us.
With depictions of war and slavery, the kid gloves must really come off when seeking to present an honest account. What of Robert E. Lee? Could he serve as the great Southern abolitionist of lost cause mythology? He certainly possessed of resentment for slavery, perceiving it as, and to quote him, a moral and political evil in any country. It is useless to expatiate on its disadvantages. Well, we're off to a good start, but then he'd continue. And I quote, a greater evil to the white than to the black race. And while my feelings are strongly interested in behalf of the latter, my sympathies are more for the former. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. While it would prove disappointing to hear from someone of a modern-day sensibility, this is highly typical rhetoric of both Southerners and Northerners of the 19th century. We could go further, denouncing of abolitionists as, and I quote, the systematic and progressive efforts of certain people of the North to interfere with and change the domestic institutions of the South can only be accomplished by them through the agency of a civil and servile war. There again is the mention of servile war, and he echoes similar sentiments to Jackson in relation to divine providence. As for his own involvement with slavery, and most prominently in his history, would be with his in-laws' Arlington plantation. He would write to his son that George Washington Parke Custis, his father-in-law, had left him with an unpleasant legacy. And unpleasant is an understatement. With the plantation in considerable debt, Lee sought to extend the term of bondage beyond the 5 years offered via his father-in-law's will. There are also the accounts of Wesley Norris, enslaved at Arlington, who recalled Lee ordering the whipping of him and 2 others who tried to flee. Eventually, and with the refusal of the state of Virginia, Lee would then execute a deed of manumission, freeing all enslaved people of the Custis estate. While there's no mention of these circumstances in the movie, the novel again did establish the challenges Lee faced when returning home from Texas. We receive a chapter where the shadow of this pivotal moment in Lee's life and his own involvement with slavery would be laid bare, showcasing the uncomfortable power struggle and ugliness with having a free man and former slave of the plantation returning to obtain the freedom of a family member. In summary, the movie Gods and Generals doesn't merely gloss over the atrocity and horrors of the Civil War, including the politics and forces at work that led to the bloodiest conflict in American history, but also goes so far as to indulge in Confederate narratives that yield of a mostly flattering historical representation, while degrading the other side and then proceeding to sanitize, even at points glorify, the barbarism and persecution that took place.
And whose side are you on?
In respect to this conflict, I believe, at least to varying degrees, both sides are right and wrong. A typical assessment of most wars.
Well, you know, that's just like, your opinion, man.
With the North, despite my efforts and all the arguments presented, I'm incapable of rallying around the flag that was the Union's preservation. The secession debate is quite fascinating, and the right to secede and obtain independence through democratic process seems a justifiable and relatable war aim as recognised throughout history. Naturally, the result of this conflict would provide the answer to this constitutional issue, and it does make the Union come across as hypocritical considering its own origin story. slavery. However, and as for the South, it's a difficult proposition to justify independence and liberty when the principal precursor to the desire for secession revolves around denying others that same right.
What do you know about it? Nothing.
Again, and as an outsider, perhaps this is true, and I've only managed to showcase my own naivety. But many have often expressed curiosity for hearing an outsider's point of view. A parting thought. When referring to Lincoln, the ugliness of slavery with respect to the nation's history and Reconstruction, and future prosperity for all, well, this needed to be a burden borne from both the North and the South. One of the great questions unanswered is with how Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction both would have shaped the nation of back then and of today, of what he'd have further accomplished. Reconstruction is a very interesting subject of history, often not attributed the same attention, and I'm eager to learn more with any good recommendations. Keeping with this, Robert E. Lee is also a fascinating individual. While the Lost Cause mythology elevated him to a status beyond mere mortals, the course corrections seem utterly ridiculous. As a general, and I shall leave this for the future, he was frankly remarkable, but there's little mention of his exploits toward the end. He could have let this conflict devolve further into guerrilla warfare, refused to accept defeat, and rebel-roused. He did not. Ironically, he became a unifying presence who'd emphasized the need for the binding of the nation's wounds, sought no glorification, exercised of a clear intent for the future, and his actions would repeatedly speak louder than simple words. I don't have to agree or condone his history with slavery or his views on racial equality, but I do have respect for his generalship and with mostly how he ended things. Could he have done more? Possibly. But he gave all he had to his home state, not a young man either or of quality health. To borrow from Chick, and when speaking to Beauregard, and I quote, "I want him to be not a subject of scorn or adulation, but a man worthy of understanding in an age where nuance and empathy has become a lost art," end quote. Beyond balance, I would argue that this might be the movie's greatest failing also, its inability to explore humanity for all its good, the bad, and the ugly.